All right. So before we get started, kind of go through some housekeeping stuff. So, um, that fourth Canvas discussion and that fifth quiz were due yesterday at the end of the day. So, those discussions should get graded fairly quickly. They should start popping up in on your grades. The only thing left that we have is that fifth Canvas discussion due by the end of the day Thursday. Got that sixth quiz. Once again, it's a little bit shorter. So I think it's only 12 questions due by the end of the day, Thursday as well. And then those daily quizzes. So the one was kind of due before we started class today. That one from yesterday will be due before we start class tomorrow. Um, and then that extra credit quiz that if you complete it, as long as you complete it, you'll get the full 3 points. So whether or not you get the questions correct or not, I had to have some answers set there. So I'll get it updated once that passes tomorrow so that you can see you get that full 3 points of extra credit if you just submitted answers to those three. Now they're related to the final, so it's worthwhile to kind of take some time to make sure that we have things kind of um, understood correctly for the final, make sure that our devices are working with honor lock. Other than that, that should be all of the due dates that we have remaining. Um, I posted an announcement. This was in a prior announcement, but it just has kind of as a standalone announcement information about the final. So it doesn't quite match up with that extra credit quiz, only because I think I'm going to expand the time in that you can take it from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. I should be available via email during that whole time if there are technical issues or anything arises. It has some information just about what you can use. So scratch paper, handwritten notes. It'll have the calculator that pops up through the Onelec system, but you can have a physical calculator, no web browser or any other programs open on your computer, and then a working kind of webcam. Um, Other than that, today I'll finish up a little bit of Module 12 material. I'll mention something about Quiz 6 once we start covering that. And then the rest of class, I've got a set of questions I think would be good to review, but really, I think the most effective use of our time is if you guys have questions over any of the old practice problems, quiz 5 or even quiz 6, I can kind of work through some of those um, or similar types of questions um, here today. But other than that, are there any logistical questions before we kind of dive into material here? Okay. All right. So the two slides we didn't cover from Module 12 would be 26 and 27. I'm not going to worry about 27 here. It was kind of an interesting example, but I want to make sure we're taking our time to kind of review concepts that'll pop up on the final. This wouldn't be one of them. Now, the one that is fair game, and actually one of the questions on quiz 6 was related to this. I hadn't really thought about the fact that I thought we'd get through it yesterday because it was available if you took that sixth quiz yesterday pretty quickly. One of the questions would be something we didn't quite cover, and so I think it's question 11. Um, I'll adjust once that due date passes so that I'll kind of give credit for that question. Um, so you'll kind of see that get updated once that due date for quiz 6 passes, just in case someone started earlier and didn't realize we hadn't yet covered this question or this topic. Okay. So I'll kind of write down what we have in that slide to kind of cover really the last thing we need for Module 12. So anything we were doing with Module 12, talking about exchange rates, they were always actually, we didn't clarify this, but it was actually the nominal exchange rate. So you might think about the nominal exchange rate doesn't matter. Even if I get €5 for every dollar, well, if prices in the Europe or in the European Union are significantly higher, it doesn't matter if I get more or fewer euros if I can't buy as many products. And so what we want to do, similar to what we did with the interest rates, is we want to adjust that exchange rate for prices, price differences in the domestic and foreign market. So here we would say our real interest rates are whatever that nominal interest rate was, or sorry, exchange rate was whatever the nominal exchange rate was times the price of the domestic market. So we were always kind of looking at exchange rates for the US, so that kind of keeps it a little bit more simple for us. And then prices in the foreign market. Okay. So really is the extent of which I'd ask you questions about this is thinking about how do you calculate if I know the nominal exchange rate, I then give you price levels in the US and the foreign market, asking you to then tell me what that real exchange rate is. It's just a matter of getting our numbers plugged in and kind of doing this math. Okay. So this would be what, like 4 point something, right? It's just a matter of getting this entered into our calculator. Now, I could also kind of give you the real exchange rate and then ask you to back out, maybe I tell you exchange rate is 5. I could then leave out the nominal exchange rate and you could kind of one equation, one unknown, solve for what that should be. Okay. So that should hopefully be an easier question, I think, that you could see pop up on the exam. Now, another question I could ask you related to this, and that popped up on the quiz, is let's assume that prices in the foreign market increase. Right? What's going to happen to our real exchange rate? Well, even if the nominal exchange rate stays the same, if prices increase in the foreign market, we would see that that fraction, right, goes down, lowering kind of that real exchange rate. So this is the idea that even if I'm getting 4 euros for every dollar, if prices are higher in Europe, that same 4 euros has less value, which would mean that our exchange rate actually is lower, right? We're technically, even though we're getting the same number of euros, they have less value. Okay. So this is really the final thing. It's not too crazy here, but this is what that question would kind of relate to in terms of converting nominal to real exchange rates. Okay. So in addition to that, just to kind of do a little review of Module 12 here, and I think we went through it pretty quickly yesterday. I changed it a little bit, so I want to work through a different example here today, but we're going to take a look at question 2 of that daily quiz, okay? So if I were to work through this, and I've kind of altered some of the things here, so I've got currently, we are at whatever that long-run GDP level is, or think about it here, we have no gap. If we experience a productivity increase in the US, what impacts will that have on the exchange rate? What's going to then be caused either a recession or inflation, or inflation or recessionary gap? And then what should the government do in response? So we're kind of connecting this international market for the US dollar to fiscal policy responses. Okay. So if we were to kind of draw this out, we could think about here, I've got, let's do a new blank piece of paper here. I started out, if I'm thinking about the US economy, we had a scenario where we started out where there was no gap. Right? So long and short run GDP are exactly the same. If we then saw an increase in productivity, so let's think about how that's going to impact the market for the US dollar in terms of the price of the US dollar or the exchange rate. So we said we'd have some demand for the US dollar, we'd have some supply of the US dollar. The resulting exchange rate would be where supply is equal to demand. If productivity increases in the US, essentially what that does is it means to produce the same good, the cost to companies is now lower. That's going to have the resulting impact that it lowers prices, right? If I'm more productive, each unit costs me less, right? That's going to result in I would be willing to accept lower prices than before. So if prices are lower in the US, what happens to the foreign demand? Well, if prices are lower, more people are going to want to purchase goods or hold US dollars. So that should cause an increase in the demand for US dollars. Let me just kind of make sure this connection is good here for us. Sorry. So what impacts is that going to have? Well, it increases our demand, which would then increase our exchange rate. Okay. We said if exchange rates increase, the next thing we can do is determine, okay, if the exchange rate goes up for the US dollar, that means the US dollar has more value. Right? If it has more value in international markets, that means the US is going to be able to increase their imports. Okay. Now you can always just stop there. I'll kind of walk through a secondary effect that kind of occurs, which pushes the exchange rate in the same direction or pushes the economy in the same direction. But let's think about if imports go up, if we're kind of determining net exports by exports minus imports, if imports go up, we're subtracting a larger value, net exports are going to decrease. Okay. Now, you could take this one step further and it'll kind of give you the same directional changes. But if the US dollar is more valuable, that means that whatever that foreign currency is, it has less value, which means they can't purchase as many US goods as before. Exports would decrease, which has that same impact on net exports. So changes in the international market or the market for the demand for the US dollar is going to influence net exports. So what impacts is that going to have on our economy overall? Well, remember, aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus net exports. If net exports go down, our aggregate demand is going to decrease. Okay. Now, what does that do to the long run GDP? Well, long run aggregate supply hits this new aggregate demand at the exact same level, so there's no change in long run GDP. However, in the short run, where does aggregate demand hit short run aggregate supply? And here in these types of problems, I'll kind of always give you the added assumption. We're only going to be thinking about shifts in the long run aggregate supply. We're just going to be thinking about that. We're going to shut down the short run aggregate. We're always assuming there that the short run aggregate supply doesn't adjust. Okay. So kind of that simplifying assumption means that we know the short run GDP is now going to be lower, right? So if short run GDP is less than our long run GDP, we said, what type of gap do we have? Well, if GDP is too low, you can think about we're in like a recession or we have a recessionary gap. Okay. So there we would see the exchange rate increase. The subsequent effect would be that it causes a recessionary gap. What should the response by the federal government be? Well, if the government wants to increase GDP, right? We want to push this back to the long run levels. We don't want to wait for short run aggregate supply to adjust. If we want to increase aggregate demand, what tools did the government have? Well, it could increase government spending. I think here this question specifically asks about government spending, but they could also do what? Well, the second tool that the government had was that they could change taxes. If we lower taxes, what happens to consumption? People have more money, we would see an increase in consumption. So either one of these fiscal policy tools would increase our aggregate demand curve, okay, and help close that recessionary gap. Any questions there before we keep? I'm going to add something in here that wasn't part of that question. So one way, so this is a pretty complicated question in terms of we're connecting the market, aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, the US economy, to the exchange rate market or the market for the US dollar. Now, let's assume we had this same setup, right? And just to kind of simplify some of, like, just to kind of start from a graph where we're going to add in this additional question. So let's assume we said that, excuse me, productivity increase ended up causing eventually a recessionary gap. So if we had, initially we started out here. Here was kind of our long run GDP. Right? And this is where maybe drawing these, well, I'll put them on the same graph. I think it'll help, but you could draw them out separately if you wanted to. Initially, we said there was an aggregate demand decrease because of that change in the international market. So if that occurred, we said there would be a recessionary gap because that aggregate demand decrease from that original increase in US productivity, that's going to cause my GDP in the short run to decrease. Now, what is it also doing? It's causing my prices in the US to also decrease. Okay. Now, if simultaneously we have a fiscal policy response from the government, well, what is that going to do? Anytime we see an increase in aggregate demand, so here, if I increase government spending, that's increasing my aggregate demand. That should push GDP up, right? We've got this expansionary fiscal policy. We're increasing aggregate demand and GDP. And then that would also cause my price levels to go up. So what has to be true, excuse me, if I told you that either prices have increased or I told you that that recessionary gap that originally existed after this simultaneous change, what if we have higher prices? What if we responded so much that we've now caused an inflationary gap? Well, what would have to be true is that our new aggregate demand curve would have to be even higher than prior to that change that the international market caused, or the market for the US dollar caused. So in order to have prices go up or this inflationary gap kind of created, the effect of that productivity increase, right? Because it was pushing GDP in the short run down, it would have to have a smaller effect than what was causing the GDP in the short run to increase, right? So it would have to be that that government spending had a larger effect if we eventually see that price levels are not lower than before, but they're in fact higher, right? So I can kind of think about why this is the case. So let's say that effect caused by government spending was very large, right? It was larger than the effect caused from that change in the US productivity and its impacts on the exchange rate. If that's the case, right, we shift that aggregate demand way up here, we're going to end up at higher price levels, higher GDP in the short run. And we now have, instead of a recessionary gap, we've increased government spending too much. We now have an inflationary gap. Now, that's only if that effect from fiscal policy is greater. Let's say the effect of fiscal policy is actually lower. Well, that would look like a very small increase in aggregate demand, in which case, where is our new kind of short-run GDP? It's still too low. So the relative size of those changes will impact whether or not the government was able to kind of close that gap. If it's not as large as that effect from the exchange rate change that was caused by an increase in US productivity, we're still going to end up with a recessionary gap. GDP is still too low. But if we over respond, we could actually go from a recessionary gap to an inflationary gap if that change caused by government spending was in fact larger. Okay. So this is where we kind of are thinking about, not only do we have simultaneous changes in aggregate demand, it's one of the changes is coming from fiscal policy, the other is coming from these international markets, the quantity of the US dollars supplied and demanded. Any questions on that idea? So from here, the rest of class, I'm just going to open this up to any questions that people have over practice problems, quiz questions, probably specifically 5. If I don't get a lot of questions, I've got some things that I think would be helpful to work through. But my plan here today was to answer as many questions as people had. And you can put them in the chat. You don't have to. So question 10 on quiz 5. Yeah, so let me see. Let me pull this up. Oh, I had it somewhere. Ready to go. There we go. So question 10. That was the one that was asked, right? Let me make sure. Question 10. Yep. Okay. So here, and this is a good question, I'll kind of add some stuff in, kind of tie question 10 and 11 together. So when we're thinking about the Fed injecting money into the economy, we said that the change in our money supply was equal to the change in, it's not the change, sorry, well, it could be change, but we're thinking about the initial deposits into the bank, and then the total effect on the money supply was 1 over that required reserve ratio. Okay. So here we were told what, I guess everyone's values are going to be a little bit different here. So I'll kind of use, I think, some more simple. Let's say there was a $20,000 initial deposit into the bank, and the required reserve ratio was 10%. Okay. Well, when this comes from new deposits, when the bank receives that 20,000, they're going to have to set some of that aside. How much do they have to set aside? Whatever that required reserve ratio is. Okay. So if that required reserve ratio is 10%, here, when we use it, we're using the decimal form. So I took 0.1 here. What? They've got to set aside $2,000. So what is the actual initial amount? This is not the amount of the deposit. This is the amount of the initial, this is the initial amount of money that the banks have to loan out. It's not the full 20,000. In fact, here it would only be what? 20,000 minus 2,000. So they only have an initial amount of funds to loan out of 18,000. Okay. So once we kind of set aside some of that initial deposit because of that required reserve ratio, the impact on the money supply will now be that initial amount that we have to loan out times 1 over that required reserve ratio. Once again, this is the decimal form, not the percent. All right, so if we do this, we have what? 180,000 would be the total change in the money supply from initial deposits of 20,000. And you can think about it here. This is initial deposits from non-government entities. Okay. Now, this is kind of scenario one, where I've got non-government entities making deposits into these banks. The initial amount coming in, the initial amount we have to loan out, we'd have to take out those required reserves. Okay. Now, a follow-up question, I think this is kind of like question 11. What if instead we have the Fed buying US bonds or securities, right? Well, if they're buying them, they're giving the banks money, right? So now if they buy, say, a value of $20,000 of bonds and securities, that is not subject to initially that required reserve ratio. So now the initial amount that the banks have to loan out is the full 20,000, right? So I would go through the exact same process. It's just that now that initial amount that they have to loan out is the full 20,000. There, the change in the money supply would be 200,000. Or notice when the initial amount is higher, it's not subject to that required reserve ratio because it's not a non-government deposit, it's a deposit from the Fed. It actually has a larger impact on the money supply. Okay. And then additional questions we could see here is what would cause larger changes in the money supply, not just thinking about if it's from the Fed or a non-government entity. What if they increase that required reserve ratio? Well, if they increase that required reserve ratio, the total effect is going to be that the change in the money supply, this fraction goes down. So we would see that the money supply actually goes down, or the change in the money supply, sorry, goes down. Any questions on that? I'm going to add one more thing in here before I get to the next couple questions. So let's say instead, I have that the Fed instead sells US bonds or securities. Well, if they're selling these to banks, they're essentially taking money away from them. So we would go through the same process to find what the change in the money supply was. But if the Fed is selling these bonds and securities, we would actually see the change in the money supply, right? It's actually negative, or that the money supply itself is going down. Okay. All right. And then have these other questions in the chat, so I'll kind of work through them in the order in which they were asked. So any questions on this one before we keep moving? So the next one is what? Question 17 and then 7. So if we look at that quiz, so you said 17 was the first one, right? So here we've got monetary policy and the impacts that will have on price levels, net exports, and what that will do to GDP. Okay. So here I've got price levels decrease, contractionary monetary policy. Okay. So we're talking about monetary policy changes. The first thing that we're going to be looking at is the quantity of money in the US. So this is not the international market, right? This is the domestic market, just the amount of available US dollars that are out there. So the international market is the amount of dollars that are out there in international markets. That's only going to be a fraction of the overall money supply. So we're thinking about here, we said there's going to be some demand for money. The Fed can alter what the money supply is. Okay. So if we initially start out, here's kind of our initial equilibrium interest rate. If they engage in contractionary monetary policy, this is where maybe it's helpful to kind of work backwards. Okay. So if we want contractionary monetary policy, what we actually want is for GDP to decrease, right? So if I'm thinking here, if I was looking at my aggregate supply aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, let's just assume we start out, and this would be kind of on the exam. I'll always throw this in at the very beginning that we always start out, unless I tell you otherwise, start out assuming that we are currently in a position where there's no gap, right? And so instead of saying that long run and short run GDP are the same, well, what is our short run GDP? It's whatever the current GDP level is. If I'm telling you that's the same as potential GDP was our long run. So the way I will phrase this on the exam is this. So when I tell you the current and potential GDP are the same, that means we have no gap, right, in short and long run GDP. So it's just another way of saying that short and long run GDP are the same. So here we had contractionary monetary policy. This is where we kind of have to work backwards. Because if we had contractionary monetary policy, we're actually lowering aggregate demand, right? Contraction, we're pulling it down so that we would actually be decreasing our short run GDP. Now, why they would want to do this, usually it would be in response to an inflationary deflationary gap that makes the problem more complicated. We're just assuming that they've engaged in contractionary fiscal policy, or sorry, monetary policy. So if they want to lower GDP, right, by this contractionary policy, we said what component of aggregate demand is the Fed influencing? Well, they're influencing investments. So if they want to decrease GDP and aggregate demand, what do they actually need to do? They need to decrease investments into physical capital. So this is where it gets a little bit tricky to think about exchange rates and how they impact the international market versus the domestic market. So if firms want to make more investments into physical capital, they have to take out loans. We're thinking about how does that interest rate make it more or less costly for these firms to borrow money? Well, if I want firms to invest less, I need to make it more costly to borrow. If I make it more costly to borrow, that would actually be increasing interest rates. So if we want to increase interest rates, what does the Fed want to do? They actually want to decrease the money supply. What are the tools that they have to decrease money supply and consequently increase real interest rates? Well, we said there's two tools. These are the only two I will expect you to know in the exam. We have interest rates and discount rates set on reserves. The only two tools I'll focus on are going to be that the Fed is using is either buying or selling securities, or they could increase or decrease that required reserve ratio. So if we want to decrease the money supply, we actually want to take money away from the banks. We should, in this example, sell securities, right? When we sell them, the banks are buying them, we're taking money away. We're lowering the money supply. What will we have to do the required reserve ratio? Well, we want banks to have to set more money aside. They can't loan those funds out. How do we do that? We require them to set more aside, or we increase that required reserve ratio. Okay. So that first part, if we're engaging kind of in this contractionary monetary policy, um, what impacts then is that going to have on price levels and then the resulting net exports? Okay. So here we've just determined if we want that contractionary policy. So you didn't necessarily have to go through all of this to answer this question. Um, because I told you it's contractionary, you know they're shifting aggregate demand down. I just want to kind of work through this so that we can connect what would actually, if it was a different problem, what would actually cause contractionary monetary policy, decreases in the money supply, which we could use these two tools for. So if we have this contractionary monetary policy, what did we do to prices? We lower prices. Okay. So if we've lowered prices, right, that was kind of the result of that contractionary monetary policy. What are the subsequent impacts on net exports? Well, if we're thinking about net exports, we need to then think about the international market for the US dollar. Okay. So if we have the demand for the US dollar, we've got the supply of the US dollar, and we have our exchange rate. We just said if prices go down in the US, what impacts would that have? Well, if prices go down, are other countries going to be more or less likely to want to buy US products and hold US dollars? Well, if prices are cheaper, when they get a US dollar, they can buy more. We should see an increase in the demand for money. So what does that do? Well, here is our old exchange rate. An increase in the demand for the US dollar would cause our new exchange rates to be higher. Okay. So this problem, I've connected the Fed's decision to the economy overall, but now really this question, like I was adding that in. The real question here was connecting the US economy, us wanting to kind of lower GDP, and what would have to happen in the international market to do that. So if prices fall, demand for the dollar increases, exchange rates are higher. We said if the exchange rate in the US is higher, the US dollar has more value, which means that if we're buying things from other countries, we can now buy more, or imports would go up. Now, you can stop here. So I'll kind of walk us through this here in a second. So doesn't this contradict the formula that we use? So remember, these are not real exchange rates. These are nominal exchange rates. If you want, I could take it a step further, right? And it becomes more complicated, but I'm not going to do that. Right? So remember, when we're talking about exchange rates here, it's the nominal exchange rate. Hopefully that clarifies that question. So here, if we're thinking about net exports, that's going to be exports minus imports. So if we increased imports, we're subtracting a larger value that would actually decrease our net exports. Now, there's an additional effect that the exchange rate change has, but you don't have to always think of both of these. If you just want to think about how imports would then be impacting net exports, it's always going to be the same, which is if the US dollar is more valuable, what happens to the value of the foreign currency? It becomes less valuable, in which case they can't buy as many US products, so our exports would go down. So both of these impacts would kind of cause net exports to decrease. So whichever way is easier for you to think about, I think this one's probably easier, that when the exchange rate for the US dollar is higher, it has more value. Imports are going to go up, which lowers net exports. So net exports are going to decrease was the second part um, of the uh, of the question. And then what will this secondary response be? So remember, we had the initial change in monetary policy that was causing those prices to go down. This secondary response from international markets, what is that going to do? Well, if net exports are decreasing, if we go back here, here was the initial change from that monetary policy, if net exports go down from this secondary response from international markets, that's going to cause our aggregate demand to go even lower, which should do what? Cause both short-run GDP and our price levels changing in the same direction, but they kind of amplify the effects that that monetary policy had. So the initial monetary policy caused prices and GDP to go down. But if we had the secondary effect, which is its impact on the international markets and the exchange rate, that additional secondary effect would cause those to go even lower than before. Excuse me. Okay. And I think that kind of touches on thinking about how money supply is impacting kind of those foreign currency markets as well. Now, on the exam, I wouldn't kind of tie all these. We would either kind of compare, excuse me, the market and the US economy to exchange rates, or we kind of connect that kind of money market in the US to the overall economy or aggregate supply or demand model. So there's like a complicated one where we're looking at all three. Okay. Any questions on that one until I move to the next question that was in the chat? And that answer your questions about the contradiction, or do you want further clarification? So the key there is when we're looking at this model, this is the nominal exchange rate, not the real exchange rate. Okay. So question 7 on that same quiz, we're looking at, so we've got a pre-existing recessionary gap. What will government spending do to address this? Causes real interest rates to change. So this is one in which we have two types of secondary effects that can exist from fiscal policy. So if I ask you a question, always assume that we're not factoring in those secondary effects unless the question itself is leading you to that. So just to kind of point this out, I'm looking at that quiz question. So here I have that government spending change. I'm then asking you how it impacts real interest rates. So we're not thinking about the initial impact that it was having. We're thinking about this kind of secondary impact. Okay. So if that's the case, right, we're going to say, okay, look, government spending goes. Okay, so here's the first part I asked you. So if I have a recessionary gap, what do I want to do? Well, a recessionary gap, and I'll come back to the question. Oh, on question 7. Here, I'll work through this one because it's useful, and then I'll go to the practice problems on 7. So if I have a recessionary gap, what that's telling me is that my short-run GDP is actually too low. Right? So what should government spending do? Well, if we want to increase GDP, we would actually need to increase aggregate demand, which we would do so by increasing government spending. Okay. So we'll kind of work through it this way, but I'll also talk about how taxes could also be used. But for now, we'll just focus on if they increase government spending. So we said the secondary effect of fiscal policy, right? Changes in government spending. What will that do in this, market for loanable funds, right? So this is not the overall market for money supply or money demand. It's the supply and demand just of money that's being used to be kind of loaned out. So we've got some supply of loanable funds. We've got the demand for loanable funds. Here we're thinking about that would impact real interest rates. So if we started out here, when government spending increases, that means the government has less available funds to loan out, right? So if they're thinking about government spending increases, the supply of loanable funds is going to decrease. There's less money out there for them to loan. And so we've got a supply decrease. What did that do to our equilibrium real exchange rates? It increased them. Okay. So if it increased my interest rates, right? I now want to think about, okay, what did that secondary response do in the overall economy, or how did that relate to my aggregate demand, aggregate supply model? So let's assume the question told us that that change in government spending actually closed that initial recessionary gap. So we're back to a point where we're now thinking about, okay, after that government spending, we're back to having no gap, right? So they've corrected for the old recessionary gap. There's now no gap, but now there's a secondary effect, right? So that secondary effect we said was if that change in government spending decreased loanable fund supply, increasing interest rates. Well, if interest rates go up, remember now when we're talking about investment, this is the investment that domestic companies are making into physical capital, not into like financial products, but into physical capital. So when they're doing that, they have to take out loans, right? So higher interest rates make loans more costly. So what's going to happen to investment in the physical capital? It's going to go down, right? If investment in the physical capital goes down, we have a decrease in our aggregate demand. That's going to cause our GDP in the short run to be lower, right? And so now if GDP in the short run, aggregate demand shifts, just to kind of make this point, never shift our long run outcomes, right? The aggregate demand hits long run aggregate supply here, hits long run aggregate supply here. So there's no change in our long run GDP. If GDP in the short run is now too low, that secondary effect, initially when the government spent money, they closed the gap. But that secondary effect operating through the loanable funds market then creates a recessionary gap, right? So we would have to kind of like overspend by the government in order to kind of mitigate that effect. Okay? I wouldn't ask you that, but I would ask you about what the secondary impacts would be. It would lower GDP, cause this recessionary gap. And you could even maybe be asked, although I likely wouldn't do it in this type of problem, but we could think about it just in general when we have these aggregate demand shifts. What did that do to overall price levels? It caused them to decrease. Okay. So I think that was all the questions here, and I'll come back to the ones in the chat. So I think that, yep, so that answered that, and I'll go to the practice problem one in a second since that's what you meant. So is this an example of the crowding out effects? Yes, this is the crowding out effect. Okay. So when we talk about secondary effects of fiscal policy, this was like one of the secondary effects that we had, which was that it impacts government spending would impact the loanable funds market, which then impacts our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. Right? Now, before we move on here, I could get the same impact if I didn't increase government spending. So what would another response be to a recessionary gap in terms of fiscal policy? Well, I can increase government spending or I can decrease taxes. If I decrease taxes, people don't want to take out loans to kind of pay off those taxes or currently or in the future. And so lower taxes actually lead to consumers supplying less to the loanable funds market, which then has the exact same impacts. So it doesn't matter if our fiscal policy is through government spending or taxes, that decreases the loanable fund supply, which then we said increases interest rates, decreases investment, and kind of lowers our overall levels of GDP. Okay. Um, so because we'll have time, Nick, I will come back to the practice problem question 7 here. But I think because we're here, there's something else I want to point out because we are talking about secondary effects. This is going to be the secondary effect of fiscal policy. Okay, so this is the fiscal policy was government spending or taxes. We can also have a different type of secondary effect. Okay. Now, the other type of the secondary effect is going to operate, at least of what we're doing, will purely be from changes in taxes. So let's say I've got an example, and let's say initially we start out and we have no gap. Keep choosing the wrong black marker. Here we go. So I've got no gap initially in my long and my short run GDP. All right, my price levels start out here. The second secondary effect that we could see is the impact of taxes on factors of pull. Okay. So let's assume that we have, in this question, I'll do a decrease in taxes. Okay. So if we decrease taxes, what's the initial impact that that's going to have? Well, consumption will be able to increase. That was one of the components of aggregate demand. So what did we see occur? GDP in the short run increases, but that would also cause our price levels in the short run to increase. Okay. So a decrease in taxes causes our short run GDP to go up. Right? Now, what change is it going to have on long run GDP? Well, our new aggregate demand hits long run aggregate supply at the same GDP level, so no change on our long run GDP, and then we said prices go up. Now, this is where I wouldn't draw out this secondary effect on the same graph, right? So I would think about, okay, what then? And a question would maybe ask you, after we see this decrease in taxes, what is the impact on long run aggregate supply? So this is leading us towards this secondary effect. So I'm thinking about now, if I had that initial point where I've got no gap in my short and long run GDP, if taxes go down, right? Here we can think about if it's income taxes. So if I see lower income taxes, that means that individuals hold more money. So they are going to be able to increase investments into education. If taxes are lower, now getting the same job, I'm getting more money, so I can convince more people to join my labor market or an increase in labor supply, right? Or if I were to lower corporate taxes, that means companies have more money to invest back into either physical capital or kind of making it more effective, or increases into projects that would increase productivity, right? So all three of these things, if I'm lowering taxes, would do what? Well, they're all factors of pull. So all of them would cause increases in my long run aggregate supply. So the secondary effect here is that when long run aggregate supply increases, what's happening? Okay. So relative to before, my new, where am I at here? So I want to show you. So the new long run GDP is going to be here. My aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply haven't shifted. So in all these questions where I have any type of shift in the long run aggregate supply, I'll shut down that short run supply effect. I'll tell you to assume that the short run aggregate supply doesn't shift. So here, what happened to the old short run GDP? It actually stays at the same point. So if I wanted to kind of stack these, I could think about this secondary effect of taxes is it increases one of the factors of pull, which increased my long run GDP and caused no change in my short run GDP. And then what did it also do? Well, here was my old price level, right? My new price level in the long run is going to be where aggregate demand hits long run aggregate supply. So this is actually going to cause my prices to decrease, or here we're kind of thinking about long run prices. Okay. So the secondary effect of changes in taxes actually kind of increases both short and long run GDP. So a follow-up question could be, from this secondary effect, what is going to occur? Are we going to have an inflation or a deflationary gap? So with this kind of idea in mind, when do I have, we'll think about an inflationary gap. That would be if my short run GDP is greater than my long run GDP. Well, if the initial change in taxes is causing my short run GDP to go up, and I should have color coded these the other way, sorry, just so it's maybe easier to kind of connect these here. If my short run GDP goes up by a larger amount, right? So this is going to be how would I get this inflationary gap? It would have to be that my short run GDP went up by more than my long run GDP. Okay. So what's the only way that that's going to be true is if that change in taxes had a larger impact than that change in my long run aggregate supply or one of these factors of pull. Okay. So that kind of follow-up question would be if I did have an inflationary gap after this change in long run aggregate supply combined with that initial change in taxes, what would have to be true? The change in taxes is actually greater than the change caused in long run aggregate supply. So this would be one of the tougher questions on the final for sure. Okay. There we go. Okay. Just to give you some visual support behind this, we could kind of think about here. Well, I'll do it on this graph. So if you want to, you don't necessarily have to draw this out, but I just want to kind of give you an example of why this matters. So let's say that long run aggregate supply shift was less than the aggregate demand increase. Well, there, I'm way up here. My short run GDP is greater than my long run. But if the increase caused by taxes was actually smaller than that long run aggregate supply change, I could end up with GDP that was lower than the long run. So there, whether or not a recession or inflationary gap is created matters kind of which of these changes had a larger effect. Any questions on that one before I move to that practice problem? Okay, so I've got the practice problems pulled up here. So I'm assuming this was quiz 5 practice problems and it was question 7. So I've got a government spending decrease, and initially there was no gap. What is this going to do to interest rates, and will it cause an inflation or deflationary gap? So once again, this is getting at that secondary effect that government spending will have on the loanable funds market, and then how that loanable funds market impacts kind of our overall level of GDP and prices. So here, we're thinking about, I've got my aggregate demand, I've got long run aggregate supply. I think initially this problem told us what, so government, okay. So this change in government spending is causing there to be no gap, right? So this is where, I likely wouldn't kind of combine that idea of like which effect is larger with the initial changes. So in this example, I told you that government spending is, now I already forgot. Was it increasing or decreasing? Decreasing. Okay. So if government spending decreases, but as a result, we end up at this point where there is no gap. That was kind of the setup of this problem. What would the secondary effect be? So the way that this question is phrased, it leads you to this secondary effect because it says, what does that change in government spending do to real interest rates? All right. Well, if I'm thinking about real interest rates, I'm thinking about the quantity of money. I'm thinking about my, sorry, not quantity of money, quantity of loanable funds. I've got some supply of loanable funds. I've got some demand for loanable funds. here's where that kind of initial equilibrium interest rate would be for loanable funds. Decreases in government spending, we said means that what? The government has more available funds to loan out, so that supply of loanable funds increases. So if the supply of loanable funds increases, what is that going to do to equilibrium interest rates? It's going to decrease them. If interest rates are lower, what happens to investments into physical capital? Well, borrowing is now less costly, so investments would increase. If investments increase, that was one of the components of aggregate demand. So that would cause our aggregate demand to increase. And then I think the second part of the question, is it about an inflation or deflationary gap? Yes, and I'll add in another question you could be asked. So here, my new short-run GDP is now higher than the long-run outcome. So remember, changes in aggregate demand do not change that long-run GDP or potential GDP. They only impact short-run GDP. So if my short-run GDP is now too high, I've got an inflationary gap. Okay. Now, a follow-up question to this could be, how does that secondary effect, right, that was working through interest rates or the loanable funds market, how does that impact overall prices in my economy? Well, this is where the directional change, and I wouldn't ever kind of, if I even, doesn't really matter. If I asked you for short run or long run prices, the effect is going to be the same, because where are my short run prices? They're now higher than before. But facing that new aggregate demand, where are my long run prices, where aggregate demand hits long run aggregate supply? So the impacts on long run prices are going to also push them up or be even larger than the impact they had on short run prices. But here, if I had a question, I wouldn't ask you to kind of compare those. I would just ask you what happened to short run or long run prices, in which case both answers would be that it increases through that secondary effect from the loanable funds market. And to the question earlier, this is the idea of the crowding out effect. Okay. Any questions on that? Okay. So the other question I don't think I touched on yet, Marin, was the relationship between money supply and, okay, so this is like more monetary policy questions. So let's assume that we want to change in, let me think of a good question to get at this. I'm going to actually do one where we work backwards, only because I have the exam written and I know what's on there. So let's think about, we have this international market and we know we've got some demand for the US dollar, we've got supply for the US dollar, we have our initial kind of exchange rate. Okay. If I want to know, and here we usually work in the opposite direction, so I'll kind of make that point, but this is maybe a little bit harder of a way to think about it, or harder, one of the harder questions on the exam. So let's say that I want to know what monetary policy in the US would actually cause exchange rates to increase. Well, if I want exchange rates to increase, right, what does the Fed alter? They alter interest rates, right, through the changing of the money supply. So how would I get an increase in my exchange rate? I would want an increase in the demand for the US dollar. Now, I could see kind of supply change, but here that supply change, remember, was anything in foreign markets. The Fed can't change the money supply in foreign markets. They can only change the money supply in the domestic market, so they can only influence the demand for the US dollar. So if I want exchange rates to be higher, I know that I'm going to have to increase the demand for the US dollar. Now, when we're thinking about what the Fed is altering, they're looking at the overall supply of money, not just the supply of US dollars to an international market, but overall. And so their changes in money supply we're going to impact equilibrium interest rates. Right? So here was kind of our supply of money and our demand for money. So we started out, here was our kind of initial equilibrium interest rate. If I want to increase demand for the US dollar, we said here's where investment, it's not the same as the investment we were talking about before that impacted our domestic aggregate demand. We're now thinking about companies aren't taking out loans to invest in the fiscal capital. This type of investment from foreign countries is coming from the fact that they're investing into the US dollar. So for them, higher interest rates are actually a good thing. So how do we increase demand? We actually want to increase US interest rates. So how can they increase US interest rates? Well, the Fed could do what? If I want interest rates to go up, then they actually need to decrease the money supply, right? So a question could be, in order for exchange rates to increase, what should the Fed do? Well, I could stop it and just ask you, do they increase or decrease the money supply? Here, they decrease it, right? If they decrease the money supply, what were the tools we said they could use to do that? Well, if they want to take money out of supply, right, they wouldn't buy securities. They're not giving money to the banks. They're going to sell bonds and securities, take money away from the banks, lowering the money supply. What's another tool they had to lower money supply? They can force banks to hold more of that money in reserves, so they could increase that required reserve ratio. So we could kind of work backwards here and say if we wanted exchange rates to be higher, what would the Fed have to do? So we kind of worked backwards. Now I could also ask you the reverse question. So I could say just assume, right? And here I'll use blue, but this could be a different question. Let's assume that the Fed lowers that required reserve. Well, that would increase our money supply, which would do what? Lower real interest rates. If we lower real interest rates, we make investments into the US dollar less attractive. So we would see a decrease in the demand for the US dollar, in which case we would actually then, the Fed would be causing exchange rates to go down. Okay. Questions on that idea before we... So I think I touched on every question that someone asked. If I didn't, please speak up or enter it in the chat now. Okay. So I think this is good. I wanted to hit on both of those secondary effects. Those are trickier. So that was the idea that government spending or taxes could kind of influence that loanable funds market. And then the other was that if we have a change in taxes, it can have secondary effects on these factors of pull and shift long on aggregate supply. Okay. And then actually the question that we first asked too about money supply was another one that I had kind of written down, the differences between a deposit from the Fed versus a non-government entity. Okay. Any other questions? I've got one more thing I think I'd add in here that might be helpful. Kind of goes back to Module 9 material. So, a lot of these, just to make a point, the questions that have been asked today are a lot of these ones where we're kind of tying two markets into each other. Those are definitely going to be some of the harder questions you see on the exam, right? So the one I'm about to kind of go back to is really just one change, right? We're not looking at secondary effects. We're not combining what the effects of monetary policy are to the international market or fiscal policy to monetary policy. We're just going to look at one change, right? So let's say here I had an example, and it might be set up something like this, right? So let's assume that initially I have let's do an inflationary gap, right? So first of all, you don't necessarily need what I'm about to draw out. If you know that you have an inflationary gap, you know that that means the short run GDP is greater than your long run GDP. GDP is currently too high. So if that's the case, what do we want to do? We want to decrease short run GDP so it matches up with the long run. So here, what do we want to do? We want to decrease GDP. How can we do that? We could decrease aggregate demand. Okay. So what would this look like if we had an inflationary gap? It would mean that our long run GDP is lower than where does aggregate demand hit the short run aggregate supply? Long run GDP is lower than short run GDP. That's kind of our initial setup. Okay. So here, what is the response to that going to be if we were using fiscal policy? So if we're using fiscal policy, what do we want to do? Well, we want to decrease GDP. So we want to decrease aggregate demand until we get to this point. How do we decrease aggregate demand? Well, we can lower investments. Sorry, I'm doing fiscal policy. We can decrease government spending, or if we increase taxes, that lowers consumption. Right? So these were the two fiscal policy tools that we had. Both of those would then result in us closing that inflationary gap. So this could be a question, what should the government do in terms of either government spending or taxes to eliminate that inflationary gap? Okay. As a follow-up question, if they did decrease government spending or increase taxes, what would happen to the US government's budget? So remember, the budget is going to be the taxes they generate minus their spending minus these transfer payments. We didn't really focus on this. The only two components we're going to look at in terms of the federal budget are taxes and government spending. So if we see that government spending goes down, that was one of the tools we had. Subtracting a smaller value actually increases our budget or makes it more likely, if the budget goes up, it makes it more likely we have a budget surplus. If taxes go up, well, once again, it's a different color. If taxes increase, that would also increase our budget, making it more likely we have a surplus. So both of these tools, in order to solve an inflationary gap, would be more likely to cause a budget surplus. If the reverse was true, everything just gets flipped. If we have a recessionary gap, we want to increase GDP, we want to increase aggregate demand, we would then increase government spending, decrease taxes, which would then be more likely we have a deficit. So knowing how to connect that fiscal policy response to what's happening with the government's budget, that would be another question that you could see. And that pops up on the quiz and the practice problems. Okay. Any questions there? I'll add one more thing in since we're right here, just to kind of touch on some concepts of Module 11, and then I just have some general information to mention about the final, just to help you study. So let's think through, we have this same example, right? We have an inflationary gap, okay? If I had an inflationary gap, we said, what do we want to do? We want to lower GDP in the short run so it matches up with our long run GDP. So if instead of thinking about fiscal policy, what if we wanted to think about what monetary policy would do this, right? So we've got real interest rates. We had our demand for money. We have our supply of money, right? And our initial interest rate. So this is where working backwards usually is going to be the way that these questions are set up when we're thinking about monetary policy. So what is the monetary policy response if we had an inflationary gap? Well, it's the same idea. They still have the same goal, which is that they want to decrease GDP. How do they decrease GDP? They would decrease aggregate demand. So it starts out the same whether or not we want fiscal or monetary policy to solve this inflationary gap. However, fiscal policy or the government spending or taxes, right? That's different than, well, what's the tool that the Fed has? They can influence that in real interest rate. So if we want an increase in aggregate demand, if we're talking about the Fed or monetary policy, we're thinking about how do they influence aggregate demand they do so through investments into physical capital. So how would we cause an aggregate demand decrease? We would need to decrease investments into physical capital. How would we do that? We make borrowing to make those investments more costly. Right? How do I make a loan more costly? I increase that real interest rate that these companies who are taking these loans out have to pay. Right? So once again, when it's investment in the physical capital, we're thinking about these companies are taking out loans. Interest rates are a bad thing. Right? Higher interest rates would be a bad thing. Okay. And so if I want to increase that real interest rate in order to decrease investments, in order to close that inflationary gap, what does the Fed need to do? Well, they actually need to decrease the money supply. That would then increase real interest rates, which is what we wanted. Well, what are the tools that the Fed has? Once again, I'm only going to focus on two of the four for this exam. The first thing that they could do is, well, how do I lower the money supply? I want to take money away from banks. I'll sell bonds or securities, right? They're going to have to pay me for them. I'm taking money out of the banks or out of the economy, if you want to think about it that way. What's another way we could take money away from the banks? We could require them to set more of it aside or increase that required reserve ratio. So you could be having two separate problems where one, I'm asking you about what is the fiscal policy response. Then like another type of question or another component would be like, what did that fiscal policy response do to our budget? And then a separate question could be if I have an inflation or recessionary gap, what would the monetary response be to that? Okay. And then we didn't work through one today, but I'm sure tomorrow someone might ask a question or I'll have a example to kind of show you of what if we have simultaneous fiscal and monetary policy. Once again, that's going to be where we're combining, like this is one question, this is two. If I combine them, that'd be like one of the harder questions on the exam if we have simultaneous changes in fiscal and monetary policy. So we don't have time to do that today. But one thing I wanted to mention about these problems, if we're thinking about the breakdown, you're looking at those practice problems, quiz questions, the breakdown of this final, I've written it in a way that it kind of follows the flow of what we did in class, right? So essentially, and this isn't an exact breakdown, but to give you some numbers, like questions 1 through 8 might be specific just to module 9. And then kind of, the next 8 or 9 questions. So I don't know, maybe this is like 9 through, I don't know, 18 or something like that. They're going to look at module 10, 11 questions. I'm then going to have, after that, probably like 3 questions or so where we're kind of combining like fiscal and monetary policy. So combining modules, kind of 9 and 11. 10 was technically part of 11, but they're really the same. And then, I don't know, questions. So this would be what, questions 18 through 21. And then, 21 through, I don't know, 27. We're just going to be looking at module 12 material, thinking about exchange rates. And then like the last 2 to 3 questions, I'm going to be looking at questions where we combine either module 9 and 12, module 9 and 11, right? So approximately 7 to 8 questions on each module. Then if we're thinking about 3 or 4 questions or kind of maybe more than that, 4 or 5 questions where we're kind of combining them, giving us approximately kind of that total number of questions of 30. Okay. But the flow will look like this, right? First starting out with module 9, 10, 11, combining those, module 12, and then combining 12 with those earlier modules. Okay. And anytime we have secondary effects, the questions will lead you to thinking about those secondary effects. Every other question with monetary or fiscal policy, unless otherwise kind of instructed to think about the secondary effects, we're just analyzing the impacts of the initial effect. Okay. Not sure if we're about to say about how many questions we have. So you'll notice I know we'll go a little bit long here, but as long as you guys are here, that's fine. If you want to leave, you can. Um, there's probably only going to be, I have to look at to know exactly, but probably like really only like 2 or 3 numerical based questions. If we look back at the material we've covered, we really only kind of started module 9 with some kind of equations. We started module 11 with like one or two questions with equations, and then maybe like the one we covered at the beginning of class, maybe there's like one question from module 12. So primarily this is going to be multiple choice and then kind of select all that apply or fill in the blank type questions. Okay. And I think if you look at the practice problems and you look at quiz 5 and 6, you'll kind of see like a similar breakdown in those as what the final would look like. Okay. All right.